Hello, my name is Keith Ross. Thank you for joining me for this presentation. I am live on location at the Fort Loudon Historical State Park in Bonor, Tennessee. During the time of the French and Indian War, this particular area was part of the South Carolina colony, and it was an important location for the Mississippi Valley during that conflict. The American Revolution won independence for the United States of America, but really the French and Indian War defined freedom and liberty. The ideals, the philosophies that developed during the French and Indian War, otherwise referred to as the 7 Years' War, is what really set the stage for the American Revolution to take place. This presentation will examine how the French and Indian War prepared the revolutionary generation in thought and in spirit to fight for freedom.
The American colonies were not restricted by the rigidness of English government during the 18th century. Yet the crisis in the colonies that resulted in the American Revolution was specifically constitutional. Following the French and Indian War, Americans began to question if they could govern themselves as free men. The 13 divided colonies remained divided and focused on the localities until common causes such as Indian threats forced the colonies together. In 1754, 6 colonies met together at the Albany Congress due to the upcoming French and Indian War. This event set a stage for the colonies to be tied together outside of their London connection. Civilian populations in North America were abused during the French and Indian War. People living in the frontier were especially prone to such abuse as raids from irregular forces incited terror in the lives of these residents. The French and their Native American allies were very successful in incorporating this type of warfare. One Massachusetts provincial soldier, Elijah Estabrook, in his journal on May 12, 1759, recorded a man and his wife as well as a young woman and her child were killed and scalped. The Augusta County, Virginia Execution Book F records numerous accounts of invasions by Indians in Virginia during the French and Indian War. Due to this experience during the French and Indian War, Americans and British were reluctant to use Indians against each other during the American Revolution. But this position was weakened by 1777 and by 1779 eliminated. The French and Indian War lasted longer than most states anticipated. Great Britain expected the war to take longer than states such as Prussia and Austria did, but at the same time Britain did not anticipate the war lasting as long as it did. This resulted in economic problems for each nation involved. The American Revolution began with a taxpayers' revolt and was initiated in Great Britain. Between 1756 and 1763, the Anglosphere fought the First World War against France and Spain. The war stretched across many continents. In each theater, the British were victorious. The average colonist paid only 1/5 the amount of taxes compared to the inhabitants of Great Britain, and the tax revenue from America was only 1/26 of that generated from England. With this consideration, the British taxpayers refused to carry the burden of defending the American colonies, which led to Parliament seeking other means of tax collection. Although the total taxing in the colonies was low compared to that in England, the colonists were generally upset due to taxation without representation.
One of the most influential parts of the French and Indian War was the fact that there were certain individuals who stood up and represented what the ideals of freedom looked like and what they were defined as. It was these individuals who prepared the revolutionary generation for the upcoming War for Independence.
The French and Indian War began with a wilderness clash between French troops and American provincial soldiers led by George Washington. It is apparent that Washington's role in the war was motivated by his desire for honor and gallant action, as well as the opportunities the war allowed for him. Following poor leadership decisions resulting in battle failure, King George II appointed William Pitt to lead the war effort in North America in 1757. As a leader, Pitt was impressive to both politicians and commoners. His temperament and mind were of a quality that allowed him to disregard conventional wisdom and opposition in order to push through his agenda. His oratory skill was inspiring to the listener, and his self-confidence combined with power of concentration gleamed as he spoke. Pitt was fascinated by the New World in North America. When looking at the Massachusetts Charter of 1691, 3 conclusions are drawn. First, the provincial leaders believed they had the imperial authority to exercise control over the military policy. Second, the charter mattered more than ever to most people during the French and Indian War. And third, colonists revered the charter during and after the French and Indian War and believed this constitution was more secure than it was before. As the war began, colonial legislators were hesitant to send provincial troops into the fight. This changed following the appointment of William Pitt. This was in part due to his patriotism and also in part due to immediate changes in colonial leadership he made. Instead of demanding troops to be sent, he requested they do their utmost endeavor to supply the troops. In addition, he changed the chain of command practice to allow provincial troops to hold ranks comparable to regular troops. These changes in direction immediately made Pitt the nation's preeminent war leader, freeing him to implement his war plan without opposition. As Pitt reassured colonial political leaders they would not be bankrupt or have their liberties destroyed, he received a surge of support and patriotic sentiment from the colonies. He was able to mobilize for war with speed considered remarkable even by today's standard, and the patriotic fervor of North America surpassed its own president during this time in history. William Pitt realized large numbers of troops would be required to defeat the French in North America. To meet this need, he overrode the common practice of using only regular soldiers and raised a large number of provincial soldiers in the colonies. In 1766, following the enactment of the Stamp Act, William Pitt came out as an avid supporter of colonial rights. He stated in the House of Commons that he rejoiced in the resistance of the colonists. As Pitt neared death, he continued with an aged and weakened voice to support America and urged the removal of British troops from Boston. He confessed that if he were 10 years younger, he would spend the rest of his days in the independent-spirited America. At the onset of the French and Indian War, George Washington was 2 decades away from his revolutionary leadership and even further away from being referred to as the father of his country. At age 21, Washington was a tall and solid youth, but was untried. His schooling was marginal, and his only experience was as a field surveyor and major in the Virginia militia. George Washington kept a journal in 1753 as he served in the French and Indian War. He recorded his communication with one local group of Native Americans. He stated, "His Honor likewise desired me to apply to you for some of your young men, to conduct and provide provisions for us on our way, and be a safeguard against the French Indians who have taken up the hatchet against us. I have spoke this particularly to you, brothers, because His Honor our Governor treats you as good friends and allies, and holds you in great esteem. To confirm what I have said, I give you a string of wampum." Rufus Putnam was born in Massachusetts in 1745. In 1757, he enlisted as a private in the provincial infantry. He maintained a detailed journal during the years of the French and Indian War. The final entry was dated December 1st, 1760, and stated the following: "And now soon after my return home, I concluded to not go into service any more. Not from any dislike to the service of my king and country, or any misfortune during the service, for through the goodness of divine providence, I was always prospered in some measure, and had my health entirely the whole 4 years that I have been out, and enabled to bear up under them all." When the Revolution broke out in 1775, Putnam was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel in the Massachusetts Regiment. 1 year later, Congress appointed him as the chief engineer of the Army with the rank of colonel, but preferring field command, he returned to battle, where he was highly successful and obtained the rank of brigadier general. Putnam also became a confidant to General George Washington. The colonies believed their sacrifices, both of blood and treasure, during the French and Indian War, entitled them to share in the fruits of victory. This is especially true of Colonel George Washington, as he planned to retire to his Virginia plantation. It was clear at the close of the war, Washington, as well as these others, considered themselves committed British patriots that would defend the vision of the empire.
Another impact the French and Indian War had on the American Revolution was how the colonists began to view themselves. They began to view themselves more as citizens and part of Great Britain than they had before. And because of this, they began to hold more strongly to their laws and to the rights that they had as citizens, and began also to prepare themselves for liberty and what that meant.
Popular sentiment of anti-Catholicism in the colonies was due to it being widely supposed Catholic loyalty was to foreign powers, and therefore they were not good patriots, although this view was political and not doctrinal. Christian faith, specifically a form of Puritan tradition that evolved into a uniquely American form of evangelical Protestantism, played a political role before and during the American Revolution. Republicanism embodied the conviction that unchecked power led to corruption, and the very nature of unchecked power would bring the demise of liberty, law, and natural rights. This view was incorporated in the Bible's realistic teaching of an ongoing struggle between Christ's true liberty and Satan's tyranny. Due to the similar views of virtue, freedom, and social well-being, Republican, that is, the ideology, not the political party, and Christian points of view began to merge. These Christian ideas grew closer toward Republican ideals during the French and Indian War. Colonists rallied against their enemy as they viewed the French as the epitome of evil because they practiced absolute monarchy and supported an individual pope-led Roman Catholic Church. As the crisis in British Parliament increased with mounting debt, Parliament and the Church of England replaced France and the Roman Catholic Church as the Great Terror led by tyranny. In 1864, J.T. Headley wrote a book that recorded the biographies of chaplains and clergy of the American Revolution. One chapter is dedicated to Ebenezer Prime. Prime served a church in Huntington, Long Island, where his parishioners shared his patriotism and desire to suffer for the cause. Long after his voice could no longer proclaim the doctrines of civil and religious freedom from the pulpit, he fervently prayed God would deliver the suffering country from the hands of their oppressor. Ebenezer Prime preached a sermon in 1759 regarding the divine presence with the armies of God's people, in which he stated he had assurance the campaign was one in which the Lord would deliver the French and their savage allies into the hands of the British and American forces. Many soldiers followed such messages and were inspired by the words. One example is Massachusetts provincial soldier Elijah Estabrook, who was a devout Christian. In his journal, he recorded the sermons he had heard from June 3, 1759 through February 24, 1760. Prior to the War for Independence, the colonies had no thought of union for any reason. The union established for the war was accomplished due in part to the old national hostilities felt toward France and antagonism toward religious creeds. A radical change in the attitude of leading colonials occurred between 1754 and 1774, mainly due to a new gained respect for the empire's constitution and the victory of the Great War. The victory gained newfound freedom for colonists and relieved them of fear of the French and their Indian allies. By 1774, subordination of colonies under Great Britain was no longer considered an asset in the eyes of the Americans. According to Benson Lossing in 1847, the colonies were loyal to the British Crown and expended blood as evidence to the loyalty to the king. Like Rehoboam forsook the counsel of the old men and instead leaned on the counsel of the young men, placing a yoke on the neck of the colonists. The triumph of Great Britain in a global war led to seeds of discontent and quarrel within the empire. The empire was short on cash due to Pitt's wartime tenure and the new demand of administering a global empire. Great Britain was the chief victor of the war. However, the cost of the war had more lasting impact than the war itself. Added to the expense was garrisoning the newly won colonies. As a result, the 13 North American colonies were alienated when Britain agreed through the Treaty of Paris to close newly gained lands to settlement. Colonists believed they had a right to settle these lands due to fighting to obtain the land. The animosity felt by colonists was increased when Britain decided to have the colonists pay to protect the land that they were not allowed to inhabit. The French and Indian War decided control of the North American continent and established Great Britain as a world power. In addition, the colonists became patriots, as through their lives, actions, and ideologies, they began to prepare themselves as a revolutionary generation to fight for freedom. Thank you for watching.